Of all the things we do in Renew Ministry, we spend the most time working with protectors. Protectors are often sacrificial, dedicated, and even heroic in their efforts to keep the person safe and sane. I'd like to give you 10 ways to treat protectors, 5 in this section and 5 in the next. The first is to respect them. It's common for protectors not to trust the recipient's self, or the caregiver, or the process, or the Lord. Their lack of trust often causes them to doubt and oppose our goal of finding the hurting parts and healing them. So it's easy for our parts to get upset and angry with resistant protectors and to want to bypass them. Or we might want to shame them into cooperating. But in Renew, we've learned through much experience how important it is to appreciate and respect protectors. And we work really hard not to get into conflict with them. We'll negotiate with them, but we won't go forward and work with hurting parts until we get their permission to do so. Several bad things can happen if you try to push past protectors. The first is that they may harden up, become even more resistant, and you don't get anywhere. The second is that you are able to push through past them and connect with the hurting part, but after the session, they cause backlash. They may convince the person not to return for another session. They may punish the person with some kind of self-harm for being so stupid as to interact with the hurting parts. Or alarmed firefighters may rise up and fill the person with rage, or get them drunk, or act out sexually in order to soothe the pain that's been uncovered. Or what the protectors fear may happen. The exiles get so stirred up that they shove the protectors aside, take over, and leave the person in despair or panic or an overwhelming sadness. In Renew Ministry, we've had all of these things happen. So we've learned to give protectors a voice and to listen to their concerns. Our rule is, respect protectors and don't try to push past them. Stay curious and compassionate toward them. Never get in a fight with one. Earn their trust and get their permission before working with the hurting parts they protect. Second, involve the Lord as much as possible. Everything goes much better and more smoothly when the person is able to sense the Lord's presence and leadership. Yet it can be difficult for our parts to trust the Lord enough to be willing to look to Him and desire His help. It's not uncommon for some parts to really, really want His help, even desperately, yet the parts that actually need His help don't trust Him and don't trust the self and don't trust the process enough to want Him to be involved. One complicating factor is that sometimes our own parts can pretend to be the Lord and try to speak for Him. I've had this happen in my own experience. In one session, I had connected with an extremely distraught part of me. I grew up in a home where I felt loved and safe and secure, but this part of me that I connected with realized that I couldn't stay in my home forever, that I had to leave and find someone out there in the whole cold, hard world to care about me and love me. Now, I have a very loving wife and family, so the part was obviously stuck in the past. It felt like a really frightened teenager, and I could sense its words. I need someone to love me. I need someone to care. I could see that this part of me needed to know the love of the Lord, so I tried to turn to the Lord to see what He might have to say to the part. And a thought came into my mind, seemingly from the Lord, I care. But I was surprised that as soon as this happened, an angry voice came rushing in saying, "Don't you dare say that!" At first I was startled that a part of me would speak to the Lord like that, and then I realized that the words, "I care," came not from the Lord, but from a part of me that felt it needed to speak for the Lord. And over the next few sessions and on several prayer walks, I was able to get to know that part that was speaking for God. I discovered that it was a part of me that was afraid to quietly listen for God because it wasn't at all sure that God existed. And it didn't want me to lose my faith, which it knew was so valuable to me. Once I was able to reassure this part that God had not promised to always speak directly to us like I was hoping he would, the part was relieved and hasn't interjected its voice trying to speak for God since then. Yet I've also had many times when I felt that God has genuinely and unmistakably spoken to my heart, sometimes in incredibly tender, heart-healing ways. And it has been my experience that when I'm looking to the Lord, asking him to lead, and trying to notice his presence or direction, something good always seems to happen. And I'm convinced that whenever a person can sense his presence, or whenever a part is willing to genuinely seek God's help, good things happen. So I encourage you to point the person toward the Lord and toward dependence on him. But you may be wondering, what about the teenage part that seemed to be stuck in the past? Well, over the next few days and weeks, I found myself often talking to this part of me and filling it in on my adult life, showing it memories, and even introducing it to my loving wife and caring family. Now, I know that stories like this can seem bizarre, but I've found that many of us really do have hurting parts that are stuck in the past, and that once we connect with them and listen to them, they do actually need to be oriented to life in the present. So number 2, work with protectors by involving the Lord as much as possible. The third way to work with protectors is to find the recipient's self. We've already talked about the question, how do you feel toward the part? This question allows us to discern if a person is connected with the self and its 8 C's. And whenever there's an absence of the 8 C's, this question turns our attention to the protectors that are blended with the self so that we can ask about their fears and see if they will agree to step back for a while. The more sense of self the recipient has, the smoother the session will go. Fourth, stay in your own spirit-filled self. It's common for recipients to come fully blended with a protecting part. Let's say a really angry part. Something has happened in life and they're filled with anger, and it's clear that this angry part has taken over. And when you try to negotiate with the angry part and get it to step back so that the person can look at the hurt and disappointment under the anger, it becomes obvious that that's just not going to happen. And the person has no sense of a curious, compassionate self. In this case, the caregiver's self will need to work with the angry part in what we call direct access. That will probably involve listening to the angry part for a while until you understand the reasons for its anger and can express some empathy. Once the part feels heard, it will be more willing to step back and look at the more vulnerable emotion beneath the anger. Just as with anger, a person can come fully blended with an anxious manager or a discouraged manager. Often these managers refuse to step back, and the caregiver needs to provide the curious, compassionate, and courageous leadership that's needed. Understandably, these kinds of situations stir up our own parts. We all have parts that are afraid of other people's angry parts. Or we have parts that criticize people who waste their time playing video games, or who cut themselves, or who binge on porn. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to reprove someone and exhort them to change their behavior. All of us need that. But in a Renew session, we're trying to look deeper and find the painful belief that's under the acting out, so as to bring God's healing in perspective. And in order to do this, we need to remain curious and compassionate and courageous and patient and gentle and filled with all the fruit of the Spirit. So my admonition to you is this: get your own healing. The more you find God's healing comfort for your own hurting parts, the more you'll be able to work with Him to bring comfort to the hurting parts of others. But no matter how much personal work we do, it's inevitable that there will be times when our own parts are triggered during a session. When that happens, I'll silently talk to my part. I see you, and I understand your concerns. They make sense. This alone can help an objecting part relax. And I might also try to bring some truth to the concerned part. For example, I might remind an anxious part that no matter what happens, we're accepted in the Lord, and we're going to live forever with Him in paradise. Often this really helps. What if you find that one of your own protectors has taken over and pushed the recipient, or was dismissive toward a part, or has expressed irritation with a part? My advice is to apologize. Let the recipient know what happened, and that you noticed it, and have asked that part to step back, so that you can be more fully in self. Sometimes it's helpful for the recipient to see that you also have parts, and you're working with them as well. The fifth way to work with protectors is to follow the Renew roadmap. In our last session, we talked about the 5 steps of building a relationship with a part. Find it. How do you feel toward it? Connect with it. Affirm it. And negotiate or unburden it. Renew's roadmap gives you a path to follow. Let's look at the map. First, you find the target part, making efforts to notice it and observe it. Step 2 is to ask, how do you feel toward the part? Now here, there's a fork in the road. If they genuinely have any of the C's of self, you continue to get to know the part using step 3 through 5. If they feel anything other than one of the C's, you ask the protector who's feeling that way to step back. If he agrees to do that, you return to step 2 and ask again, how do you feel toward that part now? You ask that again to see if there's any other protectors that they're blended with. But if the protector chooses not to step back, you briefly negotiate. You find out what his fears are and see if you can address his concerns so that he will step back. If he says yes to the negotiations, you return to step 2. If he says no, you also return to step 2, but with this protector now as the target part. When I do Renew ministry, I have this roadmap in the back of my mind. If the person has any sense of self, you go on to steps 3 through 5. If not, you ask the protector they're blended with to step back. And if it won't, you briefly negotiate with it. And if he still won't step back, he becomes the target part. One thing to remember with this roadmap is that even when you're working on step 3 through 5, protectors can become anxious and step back in. So it's important to continually be asking, how are you feeling toward the target part? In the next section, we'll look at 5 more ways to work with protectors.